So for those who haven't tuned into the Bike Bros channel before, my name is Graham. I'm the owner of Bike Bros. It's a bike shop in Cochrane, Alberta, Canada. We're dealers of Giant, Marin, Rocky Mountain, and Pivot, and Niner. What I do in these videos is I take a close look at bikes. You get to see some of the details that you really can't see without going and checking out a bike in person. I talk about those details, in some cases talk about specifications and how they compare to other bikes in the categories or against other bikes in a product range, and give my opinion on things and some feedback in some cases from personally riding the bikes. But overall the goal is to show you stuff up close, talk about it, and end up with you knowing the product better. If that sort of thing interests you, consider subscribing, liking the video, and thank you in advance for that. So, on to more about this 2023 Giant. Before I get too far into the specifics on this bike, which we'll just talk about that again, it's a 2023 Trance X Advanced Pro 29.2. I will just bring up some of the stuff to do with the Giant Trance in general, because a lot of people get kind of confused with the fact that Giant has some of the longest names out there to describe their bikes, and then within the Trance model name there are all sorts of versions which change between wheel size, the amount of travel, frame materials, all those sorts of things. So this guy here being a Trance X Advanced Pro, basically what that means is the Trance is their trail bike line with Maestro suspension. In this case, the Trance X means we're talking about a bike with 135 millimeters of rear travel and 150 millimeter travel fork. There is also a Trance 29, which has 120 millimeters of rear travel and 130 millimeter travel fork. There is also just a Trance X, which is a 27.5 wheeled bike, so 27.5 inch wheel diameter, and that particular one has 145 millimeter rear travel and 160 millimeter travel fork. So can get confusing. The advanced part of the name, when we look at all of these things that add up to the title of this bike, advanced, when you see that in a Giant model, that means carbon. In this case, they also say Advanced Pro, and that relates to the fact that a Pro will have a carbon rear end and a carbon rocker link. The Pro is becoming a little bit redundant because when the Pro model first came out, there were still legacy models in the Giant lineup that had alloy rear ends, but they're pretty much all going with carbon rear ends on these bikes now. So I hope that that gives you just enough understanding to start with so you know what the heck it is you're even starting to look at here. Okay, so now I can get into more stuff about this bike. So the basics about this bike. This Trance X Advanced Pro 29.2 is the lower price point of two different Trance X Advanced Pro 29s available in Canada. This one at $61.99 Canadian, and then there's another one that's in the $8,000 range. It has Fox Live valve on it, which means that I really don't have any interest in talking about that, because as a shop we for the most part stay away from bikes with live valve, just not being fans of electronic shock stuff. But 135 in the rear, 150 millimeter travel fork, Maestro suspension, which is a big part of what makes any of these Trances a real standout performer. Maestro, we'll just start with that. It is a patent on a shock which basically talks about there's a short link here, a short link up here. The patent essentially covers the fact that you have that combination of two short links. It is quite similar to DW link, and yeah, with some small variances, but the big thing about this and most DW links that you get is really good pedaling efficiency, really good small bump compliance, so your suspension is helping to look after those small bumps quite effectively while keeping you efficient, and then also good bottom out control. So you go off of a drop or something like that, it is quite rare if your suspension is set up right that you're going to actually feel any sort of harsh bottom out. So to start with, that is like a really important thing to know about these bikes, is that Maestro suspension is an incredibly good suspension design, well respected, and it does what it does really well. So now to get into the details on this particular bike. We are looking at a Shimano SLX 12-speed drivetrain here. So I usually touch on the fact whenever it's one of these derailleurs that has a clutch on it. There is a clutch on this. In the off position, you have minimized sort of spring tension in here. When this is turned on, you have a very pronounced spring. This off position is basically for if you need to take off your rear wheel for a flat or anything. They give you that position so that you're not battling against all of that extra chain tension when trying to remove and reinstall your wheel. When the tension is on and you have that strong spring, this is all done so that you have a drivetrain that is going to handle actual mountain biking really well. So that tension there means more tension in your chain combined with your narrow wide chain rings on your cranks, and you have a system that is going to be very unlikely that you're going to be bouncing your chain off either chain rings or bouncing around on your cassette. So that's important stuff. Your cassette here, being a Shimano cassette, has a range from 10 to 51 teeth. So a huge range of gears within that 12 speeds. And so that is going to give you a practical hill climbing gear and a givener gear at the bottom there. We're using a SRAM universal derailleur hanger on here. So nice to see that, because that means that if something happens to your derailleur hanger on a road trip or something like that, you can stop into most bike shops, and we're out of COVID now, so I think even SRAM UDH derailleur hangers should be available basically anywhere you go. As I mentioned before, we're talking about all carbon, from front triangle to that rocker link to the entire rear end here. We have some really nice both chain stay protection, top and bottom. We also have some pretty well executed internal cable routing, so you can see that it's disappearing inside the chainstay, back out of the chainstay. So nicely done. I hope you can pick up on the nice finish on this bike. What we basically have is this sparkly kind of root beer color, and when it fades into the black, it's actually a clear coat over the carbon. So you can, if you look really close, you can actually see that sort of shimmer of unidirectional carbon fiber layup. So it's quite a nice finish on these. I have seen a few of these that you'll get, and it's something to do with, I would say, most bikes, but Giants, you'll sometimes see a couple chips in paint develop in this area from chain slap and stuff. So even with all this protection, you will sometimes get a little bit of chipping on these, but certainly not bad, and I've seen much worse from companies. One of the things that stands out on this bike at $61.99 is the fact that this has Giant's carbon wheels on it. So these are a 30mm internal Giant carbon rim. So a perfect width to get really good performance out of any tire, basically between 2.3 and 2.6 inches wide. In this particular case, we're looking at a Maxxis dissector tire on an EXO casing tire, and it's tubeless ready. And Giant is a special company because they actually ship us everything in the box when we're building these bikes, so we can set these things up tubeless right out of the box for you. So it's not a case of just being tubeless ready and then you have to go and buy valves or tape or sealant or anything like that. This thing has sealant in it. It's all ready to go. One of the special things that Giant has been doing as of a couple years ago on especially models like this Trance X is giving you this flip chip in the rear end of that rocker link. And basically what that's going to do for you is help you to sort of steepen or slacken your bike by about 0.7 degrees, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but it's enough that you would actually get some noticeable effect in your seating position and the ride, the rideability of the bike in different situations. What I generally like on these is setting bikes up in a steeper position, which will raise your bottom bracket height just a little bit to reduce your likelihood of pedal strikes. Of note, regarding pedal strikes, this is a size small that we're looking at here, and a small on this bike, that is a Shimano crank, which is really nice to see. So you don't have, in many cases, bikes at this level, you still have a crank that you're not super thrilled about. I would say there is no reason to have reservations about these cranks. A Shimano Dior level crank is a really nice quality, but this size small has 165 millimeter cranks. I can't talk today. And then any of the other sizes go to 170. So this is following in the modern trends that we no longer put 175 millimeter cranks on bikes, and we're shortening cranks on a whole. And that is to do with a few things. People's complaints about pedal strikes have become more and more common over the last few years as lower bottom brackets have been employed on these bikes to get better stability and cornering. And so this is one of the ways shortening cranks is getting you away from pedal strikes happening quite as much. It also coincides with a fair amount of semi-scientific studies which are telling us that our old ideas that we needed long cranks to get torque and power are basically dated ideas. A shorter crank still gives you very much the benefit of just your pedaling power, but in the fact that you can pedal in more situations, probably in my mind means that you're getting more efficiency out of a short cranked bike than a long cranked bike. Looking at other things here, on the geometry on this bike, the chainstay length is in the 438 millimeter range. So it is right in what I would call a medium chain length or chainstay length zone, which gives you a nice balance of stability and still being able to kind of play with the bike, whether that's bunny hopping over obstacles, which shorter rear ends help you with, jumping, all that sort of stuff. So I think that this is a really good example. I'm a fan of the geometry in every aspect on these Trance X's. So this is a bike that is trying to balance all the things between climbing, poppability, playfulness, stability, descending abilities. This sits right in the middle where it's a good balance of all those things. As an example, seat tube angle, we're talking about a range from 77.2 to 77.9 depending on what position your flip chip is in, and head tube angle in the range of 65.5 to 66.2, which if you're just a numbers guy, you might think that's a bit on the steep side, but having been a guy who's gone as slack as 63.5 and my current bike has 66.5, 66.5 still rides awesome, but it does give you a little bit more maneuverability on climbs, tighter stuff, that sort of thing. Getting back to the specs, we talked about rims, tires. This dissector is a really good rear tire sort of option. It's a fast rolling tire with some decent side knobs, so once again it fits with the bike's ethos of it's going to do everything well. Back to the wheels, the one criticism you might see on these giant TRX2 wheels is that it is not the quickest engagement. So you do have potentially like that amount of play before your free hub actually engages. Some people get really concerned about that, others realize that it's not that big of a deal, but I do like to point it out. We'll step up to the dropper post. We have an adjustable drop mount post from Trance here. Interesting that Giant offers a post with that same sort of feature, and it must just be an availability thing that they can't make enough of their own posts that they're using the Trance. We've used piles of Trance posts over the years, and they're actually quite good. There's no issue with them at all. Saddle wise, we're at a favorite of mine, the Giant Romero saddle. I find it to be quite a comfortable saddle, sort of in the league of a WTB Volt as far as the kind of bums that it fits well. We have this gusset here on these bikes. When this first came out, this was a little bit unusual looking, but we're now seeing it on more of the ultra hardcore bikes, the Forbiddens, the We Are Ones. So that's sort of a solid block of gusseting above the seat tube, top tube junction is just becoming a normal thing. Before I let my camera wander away too far, one thing I will point out about our fandom of Maestro suspension is just looking at all of these links here. We have two things of very positive note to say about Maestro suspension. It is very rare that these things rattle loose, which is actually still surprisingly common on some other bikes. So you don't have to worry about mid-ride having that loose feeling that you can't pinpoint, and it actually turns out to be one of these pivots coming loose. Maestro works really well for that. As well, your bearing longevity on these, really impressive. We have seen some bikes that come in that have obviously had a long, hard, abused life, and when we pull them apart to do like a serious tune and bearing replacement, they're starting to get just a little bit notchy, but they're still functioning bearings. That is a really important thing that you don't see mentioned in a lot of tests. It's usually just this is what it looks like, or this is how it rides out of the box. But the fact that you're not having things shaking loose, and the fact that 5 years down the road your bearings are still going to be rotating, is an important thing to consider. Frame protection, sort of carrying on with the theme of the good frame protection that is offered on the chainstay, bottom of the seat stay. We have a good rock guard down at the bottom of the down tube. We also, you won't be able to pick this up unless my camera is really in the mood to show you, but there is like a 3M style shuttle guard on the down tube here. Like you can feel it with your finger that there's a thick layer of something. So you do have a shuttle guard on your down tube. We have room for a bottle on here. This being a size small, I don't think that you would get anything bigger than a small sort of 700mm bottle on here. But at least you have room for a bottle. You could maybe mount something on there too. That is where the battery off of, or when these are set up with live valve is mounted. We have, as I mentioned, internal cable routing. Not the most sophisticated way of doing it. These are just rubber plugs that we have here and then down here where they come out. Good cable management going across the top of that bottom Maestro link. So they look after this stuff quite well. You don't have cables that are rubbing up against shock bodies or anything. Once again, that sleek transition from that copper into that clear coat over the unidirectional carbon. Back to those cranks, Shimano. One thing that isn't on trend, I would say, is the fact that Giant is still using a press fit bottom bracket. In their defense, this particular model that they use on all the bikes that have press fit bottom brackets tends not to have issues. Like they sort of go hand in hand with the linkage idea that they don't loosen off, they don't cause problems. We don't see premature wear causing creaking or requiring replacement on those. Coming around here, we get to the One of the highlights, in my opinion, is this Shimano 6120 4-piston Dior level brake on here. Showing you these rotors. I believe we're looking at a 203 180 rotor sizes on here. The brakes that I mentioned, this is basically the first price point that we see these shorter levers, that sort of same distinct look as the SLX XT levers, and that's the first price point that we get into the servo wave, which means that you do get, that's basically how they make the short levers still give you ample power on these. So 4 pistons and servo wave, so this is basically the start of the high quality Shimano braking. Once we get to the fork, we're looking at a Fox Rhythm 36 with a grip damper on here. So you will see regular Fox 36s and then this Rhythm 36. The grip damper, meaning that we just have this dial here for compression. We don't have separate high and low speed compression. Is a well-regarded setup. When we're talking about the Rhythm fork, it means that this is a slightly heavier fork than the actual just regular Fox 36, but not enough to really impact this bike's weight. I hadn't mentioned it yet, but this is a 30.2 pound bike, which is a pretty impressive weight these days for a non-super high-end bike. Getting back to the front tire, we're looking at a Maxxis Minion DHF. Once again, EXO casing, setup tubeless, so thank you Giant for that. 30mm wide carbon internal front rim. So some good spec all over. These are 780mm wide Giant bars on, in this case, I believe a 40mm stem. This will go up to a 50mm stem on some of the larger sizes. 35mm clamp size, 780mm wide Giant bars, some Giant branded lock-on grips here. So overall, I would say at $61.99 you will see a lot of companies still trying to squeeze in questionable bits and pieces that would leave you wanting to upgrade stuff. I would say this is one of the first bikes that you can look at and front to back basically feel no need to upgrade. Your important things, drivetrain and brakes, good enough that anybody I think would be really thrilled with them. Cranks good enough. In some cases you'll see bikes still employing cheaper cranks on bikes at this level. Not an issue here. Fork, definitely good enough that you, unless you're extremely heavy or light or you do things really crazy that you need high speed and low speed separate compression adjustment, this fork is more than good enough for most other regular riders. You got your compression adjustment. It is of course an air fork. There's my little air cap there. Rear shock, we have pro pedal lever on there, so we have no worries for concern on that DPS rear shock. This bike is carbon, light enough, efficient enough, good enough that if you're just looking for a bike for going up, down, everything in between, even getting a little bit carried away on descents, I think that you will be thrilled with this 2023 Trance X Advanced Pro 29-2. Sizing. So this is a size small, as I mentioned before. Just to give you an idea of sizing on these bikes, a size small I would typically recommend for about the 5'4" to 5'7" range. Size medium, 5'7" to 5'10". Large, 5'10" to 6'1", and extra large, 6'1" to 6'4", something in that range. The numbers on these bikes, I usually use a size large to give a reference, and they mention, I believe, a 486mm reach on a size large. So that is these days quite a normal sort of a number. It is accounting for the fact that we're going to be riding this with a bit of a shorter stem, either a sort of a 40-50 millimeter stem, but a very appropriate reach, appropriately short seat tube so you can get long length out of your droppers. But that is my sizing advice very quickly. The positives of this bike. So, Maestro suspension, ultra efficient, bearings that last a long time, and pivots that don't tend to shake themselves loose. Excellent small bump compliance, excellent mid-travel support, and bottom out prevention. Those are all the things that basically you ask your suspension to do. Geometry, I think, is spot on. You don't have to ride really hanging over the front end to try and weight an ultra slack bike. You can go for really long rides and allow yourself to get a little bit more fatigued and not concentrate so much on feeling your weight in your triceps to get the front end to not wash out on you. Spec, this is one of the first price points that everything you see, from SLX to Shimano cassette to 4-piston Dior level brakes, Shimano cranks, DPS rear shock, a 36 with a grip damper. You basically get all the things you need without any extra hubbub of adjustments and things that a lot of people honestly do not mess with or just get confused by. So overall value, killer. Ride quality, excellent. Suspension design, excellent. So am I a fan of this bike? Absolutely. Negatives. This is a bit of a challenge. I usually bitch about bad grips, bad cranks, suspect brakes, that sort of thing on bikes. We don't have any of those things to pick on this bike. The only thing that I could find as a complaint would be where I'm pointing my little camera at down there. That would be that rear hub on these wheels. While it's not bad, that will be the one thing that higher end users would complain about, is that degree of movement before the rear hub engages. So of everything, rear hub, is it going to basically ruin any rides? I don't think so. But just so you know, to be fair and open and honest about the whole thing, that is the one thing I think between me and shop staff, if we were going to say find a complaint, it would probably end up being the rear hub. Who does this bike suit? This is a do-it-all kind of a bike. If you are just a gravity hound, go for something longer travel and slacker. If you're an XC racer, go for something shorter travel and lighter. But if your day pretty much means you park, you pull out your bike, you want to disappear for 2 hours, you're going to ride up, down, around, could be high speed, could be low speed tech, could be anything in between, this is the kind of bike that will suit you well. It's got enough travel that you're going to be looked after on anything short of enduro racing type stuff. You're going to be comfortable while still feeling really efficient. Your energy is going into propelling you, not into squishing a big bike. So this is a quintessential trail bike. Up, down, everything in between, having fun, maybe getting carried away, maybe even, well, I'd even try a basic local enduro on something like this. And I would even consider using this on a long stage race. If this was the bike I had, I don't think I'd be complaining about it. Summary. This is a $6,200 bike. It weighs 30.2 pounds. It's made by Giant. It has one of the longest names of any bicycle out there, but is also one of the nicest options on the market if you're considering how well you spend your money, the quality of suspension, the quality of ride, the quality of all your bits